Just as I raised my glass to make a toast at my son's wedding, his father-in-law, Harold Hart, pointed straight at me in front of 200 guests and said loudly, "You are not worthy of being part of my family. Your son is nothing but a parasite." The ballroom fell silent, followed by a few awkward, uncomfortable laughs. I froze where I stood, my hand shaking so much that wine spilled down my dress. But while Harold thought I was weak, he had no idea I was holding something that could destroy his entire life, something I had kept in my purse for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And tonight was that moment. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I, Marjorie Lane, 67 years old, believed I had lived long enough not to tremble at anyone's cruelty anymore. But when Harold Hart said those words, under the bright gold lights of the Hilton Hotel ballroom and with 200 eyes fixed on me, my heart tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. My whole life I tried to raise Nathan to be a decent man, respectful, hard-working, building himself from nothing. We were not wealthy, but we were honest. And Harold, with his expensive tuxedo, smug smile, and eyes full of contempt, crushed all of that with a single sentence. I heard silverware stop clinking. A few guests forced awkward smiles to cover their embarrassment. An older woman at the table near mine let out a long sigh, as if witnessing something that should never happen at such a sacred ceremony. But I stayed frozen, feeling only the cold wine seeping into the navy satin dress I was wearing. At that moment, what hurt the most wasn't Harold's words. It was my son's eyes. Nathan stood a few tables away, his face pale, his lips barely moving. "Mom." But before he could come to me, Alyssa, my future daughter-in-law, gripped his hand tightly and shook her head, signaling him to stay silent. His eyes held no anger toward me, only despair. Despair because he was trapped between the two people he loved most and couldn't protect either of us. I looked at Alyssa. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. Clearly, she hadn't expected her father to behave like that, but her fear wasn't strong enough for her to stand up against him. And Nathan, I knew he would stay silent because he didn't want to add fuel to the fire. Harold kept talking, his voice steady and sharp like a formal accusation. The Hart family has always been made of accomplished, educated people with solid backgrounds. And I want to say this in front of everyone. I hope my daughter is strong enough to lead a man who is still struggling to find his place in society. Find his place in society, he emphasized each word as if hammering it into my son's dignity. I heard a few small laughs, the nasty approval of people who judge worth by money and reputation. I brushed the wine off my dress and lifted my head to look Harold straight in the eye. I smiled, just a small smile, but enough to make him pause for half a second. Just a flicker, but I caught the discomfort in his eyes. Perhaps he thought I would run off, cry, or ruin the wedding, but I didn't. I just stood there smiling as if I were waiting for him to finish, because I truly was waiting for him to step right into the trap I had laid. Not with lies, but with the truth. A truth sharp enough to slice through the armor of reputation he'd worn for years. I tightened my grip on my purse. Inside were envelopes filled with documents, photos, statements, evidence I never wanted to possess, yet had no choice but to keep. Evidence I discovered months ago, starting with a small coincidence that, looking back, I now believe was destiny. Everything began on an April afternoon when I visited Harold and Sharon's home to discuss wedding plans. I arrived earlier than expected, and while I was still near the entrance, I heard Harold's voice coming from his office. His tone was loud, tense, stripped of his usual polished manners. "You need to hide that money. I won't let anyone on the board find out about this. You understand?" I froze, my hand resting lightly on the wooden door frame. I thought I misheard. But then Harold continued, his voice lower but threatening. And let me be clear, if this gets out, not only will I fall, the entire company will collapse. I stepped back, my heartbeat suddenly fast and uneven. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I knew it wasn't something innocent, and it definitely wasn't something a respectable man like Harold wanted anyone to overhear. When he walked out, I was already in the living room pretending to admire a painting. Harold's face shifted instantly when he saw me. Then he gave me a smile, the same one I'd seen 100 times, overly confident and perfect to the point of being fake. "Oh, Marjorie, you're early," I replied casually, but inside I knew something was wrong. After that day, the uneasy feeling followed me like a shadow. I paid more attention, I observed more closely, and the more I looked, the more the scattered pieces began to fit into something very dangerous. Sharon always dodged questions about her husband's work. Alyssa avoided talking about their family finances, and Harold constantly bragged about Hart and Sons as if it were an impenetrable fortress. But every fortress has cracks, and I, an old mother with nothing but persistence, decided to find them. I went to see Caleb Morton, a private investigator and former cop in Scottsdale. I had hired him 10 years ago for a family matter, and I knew he never did sloppy work. I still remember the look he gave me when I explained the situation. "You want to investigate your future daughter-in-law's father. I want the truth," I said. "That's all I want." Caleb sat quietly for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's begin." I never expected that, just a few weeks. Later, Caleb would return with information that kept me awake for many nights. Nights when I lay in my small home, staring at the ceiling like I was staring into a bottomless void. A void where Harold Hart's reputation, wealth, and entire glittering life were collapsing. And I knew I would have to unveil that truth at the right moment. Not to get revenge, but to save my son from a life of humiliation. The same humiliation I had just endured under the ballroom lights of his own wedding. Today, tonight, this moment was where it all began. I always thought of myself as easygoing, not picky with my son's relationships. Nathan was grown, had a stable job, and could choose for himself. But from the moment he brought Alyssa home for dinner, something inside me shifted. Not because I disliked her. Alyssa was beautiful, soft-spoken, and polite, but because her presence changed the air in my home. Something was too perfect, too shiny, too calculated. That evening, Nathan brought Alyssa over. I made pot roast and toasted bread, his childhood favorites. When I opened the door, Alyssa stood there with a bright smile, holding a bouquet of pale pink tulips, wearing a stylish dress and just enough jewelry to draw attention without overdoing it. "Nathan said you love flowers," she said as she handed me the tulips. I accepted them with thanks, but my eyes quickly dropped to her shoes, expensive designer heels. There's nothing wrong with dressing well, but with Alyssa, everything felt intentional, crafted. Nathan didn't notice at all. He looked at her with bright, excited eyes, the eyes of a man tasting happiness for the first time. I understood. I had once seen that same look in his father, but I also knew that same glow can blind someone to danger. During dinner, Alyssa was sweet, asking about my hobbies, complimenting my kitchen, praising the house decor. But several times when I spoke, she smiled, a polite smile. Yet I had the sense she wasn't really listening. Or maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was too protective of my son. But the feeling grew stronger the night Nathan invited me to dinner at Alyssa's parents' home. The Hart mansion was so large that I felt lost the moment we stepped inside. The front door stood nearly 10 feet tall, the yard perfectly manicured, the floor marble cold beneath my feet. The entryway alone looked like a museum lobby. Harold and Sharon waited at the top of the staircase. Harold in an immaculate suit, grinning wide enough to show every tooth. Sharon in a soft blue dress, smiled gently but avoided my eyes. "Welcome to our home," Harold said, spreading his arms like an MC on stage. Nathan was impressed. Alyssa wrapped her arm around his and smiled, a smile that tightened something in my chest. Dinner was filled with Harold's subtle bragging. He spoke about buying half the mansion in cash, expanding Hart & Sons, his investment portfolio, tax strategies, as if Nathan were sitting through a corporate seminar. Sharon quietly nodded. I listened, silent. At one point, Harold leaned toward me and said, "You know, my family has always protected its reputation. We cannot afford any cracks." He emphasized, "Absolutely cannot." I gave a polite smile, but inside I felt a cold ripple. People terrified of losing reputation usually have something big to hide. Sharon never once met my eyes that night. Alyssa rarely looked comfortable when family finances came up, and the expensive items around the house looked unused, too new. Everything felt like a stage set. As dinner ended, Harold lifted his glass. "My family has protected our name for generations. I hope this marriage does not disappoint us." I heard it loud and clear, a warning, and in that moment I knew the Hart family was not perfect. They only tried to look perfect, and that kind of perfection always hides something. I left that night with a certainty. Something was very wrong, and if I didn't uncover it soon, my son would be the one paying the price. Dinner with both families, the official meeting, was scheduled a few weeks later. Nathan was excited, convinced this was a step toward unity. I didn't want to dampen his joy, so I agreed, though my heart felt heavier with every passing day. The dinner was hosted at an upscale Italian restaurant, the kind Harold described as worthy of discussing the future. Nathan and I arrived first. I wore a beige sweater with an old blazer that had belonged to my late husband. Nathan complimented me, telling me not to worry, but the moment we stepped inside, my heartbeat quickened. Harold and Sharon arrived next, followed by Alyssa in a red dress that drew every eye in the room. Harold shook Nathan's hand, then shook mine with his typical performative smile. "Well, you look better tonight than the last time," he said, as if it were a compliment, but his tone sounded more like a judgment. I smiled politely. Refusing to react was the only way not to turn this dinner into a battlefield. As we sat down, Harold ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu without even glancing at the price. He told us about his busy day, board meetings, a new project inspection, contract negotiations. I noticed the way he talked about his work, as if the entire world revolved around him alone. Nathan sat up straight, trying to look mature and worthy, but I sensed the tension in his eyes. He knew tonight was going to be a test, and Harold was the examiner. He didn't wait long. The appetizers had barely been served when Harold leaned forward, placed both hands on the table, and stared straight at Nathan. "So, Nathan, I want to know your income. No sugarcoating, no warm-up. Just a bare, wallet-stripping question." Nathan froze. Alyssa turned to her father and said softly, "Dad, not now." Harold raised his hand to silence her. "I have the right to know. My daughter is about to marry him. I need to know whether he can provide the life she deserves. We'll build everything together," Nathan said, his voice small but firm. Harold laughed. "Build? You're renting a place. Your income barely covers your rent. What kind of life can you give Alyssa?" The room seemed to dim a little. I saw my son lower his head, his hands clasped together, just like when he was a child, every time he got a bad grade and was afraid I'd be disappointed. Alyssa sat beside him, staring down at her plate, lips pressed tightly together. She didn't defend Nathan, not one word, not even a gentle squeeze of his hand. My chest burned, not from shame, but from love for my child. I rested my hand lightly on Nathan's, then turned to Harold. "I don't think Nathan's job is the most important thing. What matters is that they love each other and respect each other," I said, keeping my voice calm. Harold raised an eyebrow. "Respect? May I be honest, Marjorie? You sound a little, idealistic." I smiled just as lightly as he had mocked me. "And you sound a little, harsh." Harold let out a laugh, one with no warmth at all. "Being harsh means being realistic. Alyssa was raised raised in a different environment. I don't want her to suffer, I replied. Who said loving Nathan means suffering? He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Many people don't realize they're suffering until it's too late. I'm just protecting my daughter. I stayed silent, but inside, everything felt like it was spinning. I was not used to being looked down on by anyone, but what hurt more was watching this man crush my son just to prove he was more powerful. I suddenly remembered what he said at the mansion. My family's reputation cannot afford a single crack. Tonight he was using that reputation to humiliate others, a reputation I was beginning to suspect wasn't real. Nathan tried to salvage the dinner by talking about his job and the projects he was working on, but Harold only nodded indifferently, occasionally hurling sharp questions like tiny needles. Do you plan to buy a house? How much savings do you have? Do you think you have the backbone to protect a family? Nathan answered each question quietly, but I could feel the deep hurt behind every word. Alyssa stayed silent, completely silent. She didn't comfort Nathan, didn't defend him. She looked frozen, or worse, afraid to go against her father. Dinner dragged on awkwardly. I kept my face composed, but my heart broke a little every time I looked at Nathan. When the main course was served, Harold continued, "You say you love Alyssa, but love isn't enough, Nathan. Not enough." I set my utensils down. "Mr. Hart," I said, my voice so steady even I was surprised. "I understand your worry for your daughter. We all worry for our children, but my son is a decent man, and decency is valuable." Harold smirked. "Decency doesn't buy a good life." I looked straight into his eyes, "but it helps people live a better one." He went silent for a second. Then he let out a half laugh, half sneer. "I hope you truly believe that." I didn't respond because at that moment I understood exactly what kind of man Harold was. Someone who stepped on others so he could see himself as taller. He saw Nathan as a temporary choice, as if my son wasn't worthy of climbing the golden staircase he built around his family. When dinner ended, Nathan walked Alyssa to her car. I stayed behind to get my coat. Harold approached me, keeping just enough distance to avoid seeming impolite. "I didn't say those things to insult you," he said quietly. "I said them as a warning. Your son is not worthy of my daughter." I looked at him for a long time. I wanted to say something sharp, something fierce, but in the end I simply said, "You underestimate people too easily, Harold." He shrugged. "Or you overestimate them." I turned away, but in that moment something cold and determined slid through me. I knew exactly what I needed to do. That night when Nathan drove me home, he spoke very little. I knew he was ashamed, hurt, feeling small under that man's judgment. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder, afraid of hurting him more. "You don't need to prove anything to him," I said. "You just need to live true to yourself." Nathan nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully hear me. He hadn't lost to Harold tonight. He had lost to his own fear. When he drove away, I stood on the porch watching the taillights disappear, and I whispered, "You are not walking into a marriage of humiliation. I promise you that." But promises weren't enough. I needed truth. I needed proof of who Harold really was. I needed something Nathan couldn't ignore. From that night on, I wrote down every expression, every comment, every glance Harold made. Every small detail could become a puzzle piece. And the more I recorded, the more cracks I saw in the perfect, wealthy story he had built. What I didn't know yet was that those cracks would lead to a massive secret, one that would tear the Hart family apart on the very day they thought their power was untouchable. In the days after that disastrous dinner, a dull feeling pulsed inside me like a tiny needle pressing into the palm, light but persistent, impossible to ignore. I tried to stay normal around Nathan, not wanting to add pressure, but the image of Harold, his cold eyes, his cutting words, replayed endlessly. A man like that could not be as flawless as the mask he wore. And then, one Friday afternoon, as I parked near the North Scottsdale shopping center to buy baking supplies, I happened to see something I still believe fate placed in front of me. Harold's glossy black SUV was parked in a far corner of the lot, where few cars passed. I recognized the license plate immediately. I'd seen it enough times at the Hart mansion. At first, I thought he was just shopping, but when he stepped out, something was off. He no longer wore his usual usual smug expression. He kept looking around nervously, as if afraid someone was watching. I leaned slightly in my seat, staying hidden. A minute later, a young woman, maybe in her early 30s, walked toward him. She was naturally beautiful, simply dressed. Beside her were two children, a boy around 8 and a girl around 6, and both children called Harold Dad. I felt my heart drop to the floor of the car. The little girl ran to him, hugging his leg. Harold bent down, stroked her hair with the same hand that had once shaken mine with arrogance. The young woman smiled anxiously and said something quietly. Harold pressed a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. They exchanged hushed words, their eyes darting around. Just watching them, I knew they weren't distant relatives. I didn't have experience with other people's family drama, but I had lived long enough to recognize what I was looking at. This was not a coincidence. This was a family. When Harold turned and accidentally spotted me, his face drained of color. He looked like he had seen a ghost. He shoved the children into the SUV, almost too quickly, urged the woman into the front seat, and within seconds the car peeled away, tires almost lifting dust off the pavement. I stood still for a long time, chest tight with anger. How rotten could a man be? How far could someone go with lies just to look respectable? When I finally entered the store, my hands still trembled. That evening, I called Alyssa. I didn't want to confront her, not yet, but I wanted to hear her reaction. She sounded cheerful at first, but when I casually mentioned Harold and asked what he'd been doing that afternoon, she fell silent. "Oh, he must have seen, a cousin," Alyssa said, her voice shaking so noticeably I heard it even through the phone. "One of his cousins just came back to town." I closed my eyes. The first lie someone tells when they're cornered is always the worst. I didn't push her. I thanked her and ended the call. But from that moment on, I knew I had stepped into a secret too big for their family to hide behind silence. That night, I opened my late husband's old notebook, the one he used for work, and wrote day, month, year. Harold Hart has a second family. The next morning, I went to private investigator Caleb Morton's office. Caleb was in his mid-50s, solid build, weathered face, sharp but kind eyes. He had helped me once in a land dispute years ago. He wasn't a man of unnecessary words. When I told him everything, Caleb crossed his arms and listened without interrupting. He only raised his eyebrows when I mentioned the two children calling Harold Dad. "I need the truth," I said, fingers entwined. "Not to destroy Alyssa's life, but to save my son before he gets pulled into a family built on lies." Caleb nodded. "I understand. But I want everything to be legal, clear. I want proof, and I want it fast, before the wedding." He opened his notebook and jotted down a few lines. "I'll tail him for 2 weeks. His schedule, where he goes, who he meets. If there's something off, you'll know." I exhaled, part of a heavy weight lifting from my chest. Caleb never made empty promises. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 months. I tried to stay normal around Nathan, cooking for him, chatting about his work, and I avoided mentioning Alyssa or the Harts. But when he left the house, I would sit by the window, watching the street, a quiet fire burning in me. Harold remained perfect on social media. Sharon kept posting elegant dinners. Alyssa kept smiling every time Nathan brought her to visit. But now, I saw the truth behind the pictures. Some secrets are so big that people must perform a lifelong play to hide them. On day 12, Caleb called. "Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice low, "I think you should come to the office." I knew that tone. It wasn't good news. When I arrived, Caleb placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were photos of Harold with the woman I had seen, and with the two children. Photos of them at the park, eating dinner, walking the kids to school. Not acquaintances, a real family. Caleb flipped to another page. Bank transfers, purchases, tuition payments, all funded from an account tied to Hart & Sons. He's had a second family for 8 years, Caleb said, and he's supporting them entirely with company money. My breath hitched. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Caleb continued. There are unexplained withdrawals from several construction projects. I can't confirm the full legal implications yet, but he pushed the financial report toward me. The gaps are huge. I opened each page, my hands trembling slightly. The numbers, the shady line items, the strange notes, they all came together into one clear picture. Harold wasn't just deceiving his wife and children. He was deceiving the company, the shareholders, and everyone who believed he was an honest businessman. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the small office spin around me. Are you all right? Caleb asked. I took a deep breath. I'm all right. I was prepared for this. It just still hurts a little. Caleb nodded. I closed the file. Looking at it on the table felt like staring at a fire ant nest. Touch it once, and the whole swarm would come pouring out and tear everything apart. I knew from that moment on, I had stepped into a battle far bigger than anything I ever imagined. But I also knew something else, more clearly than ever. I would not let my son walk into a marriage tied to a family built on lies. Caleb's file sat in front of me the entire evening like a stone pressing against my chest. I read every page, every number, every little scribble he had marked in red. Each line was a blade slicing into the perfect image Harold always tried to present, the same image my son was preparing to step into with blind trust. I had thought Harold having a second family was the lowest form of betrayal, but when Caleb expanded his investigation, I realized I had only seen the tip of a massive iceberg. The next morning, I went back to Caleb's office. As soon as he saw me, he stood, opened a drawer, and took out another thicker stack of documents. Mrs. Lane, he said, his voice low and heavy, I'm afraid things are even worse than we expected. I tightened my grip on my purse, my heart pounding. How bad? Caleb didn't answer immediately. He handed me a financial statement covered in numbers. Hart & Sons has hidden debts in the tens of millions of dollars. I almost couldn't believe my ears. But Harold said his company was growing. That's exactly the problem, Caleb cut in. He lied, or more precisely, he's been surviving on layers of forged documents, fake contracts, and highly sophisticated financial manipulation. My legs lost strength as I sank into the chair. Caleb opened page after page. Project accounts drained with no explanation. Funds transferred to a shell company under the young woman's name. The remaining money funneled into high-risk investments to make up the losses, which failed miserably. Where did he get the money? I asked, though the answer was already crystal clear. Caleb looked at me with sad eyes. From the low-income housing project, a large portion was siphoned off to support the second family. I inhaled sharply, not from shock, but from pure outrage. I wasn't someone who cried easily, but knowing poor families lost their homes because Harold wanted to live two lives, it hurt in a different way. What did he do to the project? I asked. Caleb placed a set of photos in front of me. Unfinished buildings, cracked brick walls, incomplete roofs, pipes propped up temporarily. They reported 100 completed units, Caleb said. In reality, they've built fewer than 40, and the quality is terrible. My hands trembled as I turned to the next page. Fake documents, Caleb continued. Inflated material costs, contractor swaps for kickbacks. Some workers haven't been paid for months. I met 3 of them. All said Harold threatened to sue them if they spoke up. I leaned back, holding my head with both hands. Each detail was a hammer blow, heavier than the last. Has anyone tried to sue? I asked. Yes, Caleb replied, but they were intimidated. Harold has cousins in major banks and friends on the city council. He knows exactly who to use to keep mouths shut. I stayed silent. A man with 2 families was bad enough, but a man who stole millions of dollars from housing for the poor, withheld wages from workers, and threatened victims, that was beyond betrayal. That was a crime. Caleb placed one hand gently on the table. I know what you're thinking. I looked up. Do you? He nodded. You're wondering if you should expose him. You're thinking about Nathan and Alyssa, too. I bit my lip. Alyssa doesn't know about this, does she? I don't believe she knows everything. Maybe a little, but certainly not the full scale. I closed my eyes. Alyssa's face flashed in my mind. The way she sat silent while Nathan was humiliated at dinner, the shaky lie about cousins, her inability to stand up to Harold even once. I didn't hate Alyssa, but I wasn't naive enough to believe she was strong enough to survive the storm that would follow. If this exploded, she would be the first to be swept away. Caleb said, "You should understand, if you bring him down, it won't just be a scandal. It'll blow up across the entire city." I opened my eyes. "I don't want revenge, Caleb. I don't want to be a hero. I just want to save my son before he ties his life to a family built on lies. If they marry, Nathan will sink with him." Caleb studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Then what you need is timing." I asked softly, "What timing?" "The moment when the truth destroys him the most, the moment when the whole world is watching him." I understood immediately. The wedding. The day Harold Hart wanted to flaunt his reputation, his family, his power. The day he believed everything was his. Respect, admiration, control. If the truth came out on that day, it wouldn't just crack his mask. He would destroy himself in front of everyone he sought to impress. I stood, thanked Caleb, and held the file to my chest like a ticking bomb. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat alone in the old chair by the window, the one my husband used to sit in when he read the newspaper, and watched the streetlights reflect on the grass outside. The cool Arizona night air slipped through the window crack, but I still felt warm. I thought about Nathan, about how he lowered his head before Harold at dinner, about how he wanted to be stronger so he could deserve Alyssa, about the future he was chasing, a future he didn't know was built on deception. I touched the edge of the file. So many numbers, so much evidence, so many voices, enough to destroy Harold and save my son. But I also knew, once I took this step, there would be no turning back. The next day, when Nathan stopped by to grab his suit for a fitting, he wore a smile I hadn't seen since the dinner with the in-laws. "Mom, things are getting better," he said. "Harold, well, Alyssa's dad, seems to be trying to accept me." I looked into his eyes, those hopeful eyes too pure to see what I had seen. "Nathan," I asked softly, "are you truly happy?" He smiled. "I have Alyssa. That's enough." I didn't say another word. I couldn't. If I spoke, I would have had to tell him everything, and the time for that hadn't come. When he drove away, I pressed a hand to my chest and whispered, "My son, I will protect you, even if it means shattering that man's perfect facade." I looked at the file one last time before closing it. That night, I understood one thing clearly. If I wanted to save Nathan, I had to let Harold collapse under the weight of his own secrets, and the wedding would be the place where he would bow before the truth. After that tense dinner with the in-laws, I could feel Nathan slowly drifting away from me, not because he wanted to, but because something thin and fog-like had formed between us, something Alyssa had woven so softly that Nathan couldn't feel it, but I could see it clearly. Nathan still visited me every week, but instead of stepping inside with his usual warm smile, he now lingered at the doorway, as if weighing something before speaking. His words began to change, sharper, more sensitive, and sometimes hurtful in a way I never imagined he could be. One afternoon, when he came by to pick up a jacket I had washed, his face looked more strained than usual. I invited him in, but he stood in the middle of the living room, hands in his pockets, staring at the carpet as if the words he carried were too heavy. "Mom," he began, quiet but firm, "Alyssa said, you're not happy about her family." I set my teacup down. I had braced myself for this conversation, but when it actually arrived, my chest tightened. "Son," I said gently, "I just want you to be happy." Nathan sighed, then lifted his eyes to mine. "Alyssa said you're jealous." My heart sank. Not because of the accusation, but because Nathan believed it enough to repeat it. "Jealous of what?" I asked calmly. "Jealous that her family is wealthier, that they have more." He paused, then added, "Alyssa said you don't like her because she comes from a better background." I let out a faint laugh, not of amusement, but of disbelief that such an idea could exist. "Nathan," I said, "I've lived long enough to know what's worth envying and what isn't. A wealthy family isn't on my list." But Nathan shook his head, as if my words couldn't reach him. "Then why do you always get upset when Harold is mentioned?" he asked. I wanted to say, because Harold is a liar, a betrayer, and a dangerous man. I wanted to open the safe, pull out every document and photo Caleb had collected, but I couldn't. Not then. Not before the right moment. Because I'm afraid someone will hurt you, I said instead. Nathan looked at me. For a brief second, tenderness flickered in his eyes, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by the unfamiliar coldness I had been seeing lately. Alyssa said you don't respect her dad, he continued. She said you look down on his success. I stayed silent. And isn't that true? Nathan's voice trembled slightly. Maybe he didn't want to say it, but he did. I didn't feel angry, just deeply hurt. The kind of hurt that sinks through bone. When your child begins to see you through someone else's eyes, you finally understand what it means to lose a child without anyone stealing them from you. I stood, placed my hand on Nathan's shoulder. Son, I said slowly, I don't look down on anyone, but I have eyes. I see things you don't yet see. I just want you to think carefully about this marriage. He gently brushed my hand off his shoulder instinctively. Mom, can't you just accept Alyssa? I swallowed the ache in my throat. I can accept anyone who makes you happy, I said, as long as they treat you well, as long as their family doesn't make you feel small. Nathan frowned. That's your view, Mom, not mine. I didn't respond, because I knew the more I spoke, the more he would think I was against Alyssa, and that was the last thing I wanted before the truth came out. When Nathan left, I stood by the window and watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street. I placed a hand over my heart, feeling it race with fear. Fear of losing him, fear that the truth would come too late, fear that he saw me as controlling or selfish, fear that he would marry into an illusion and one day pay for it with his whole life. Sometimes motherhood isn't pulling your child into your arms. It's watching them walk toward a mistake and waiting for the exact moment to pull them back before they fall off a cliff. That night, I went into my bedroom, opened the closet, and took out the small safe I kept under the spare blanket. I placed it on the bed and slowly unlocked it. Inside were the 3 brown envelopes I had been preparing for days. One envelope had Nathan's name on it. One envelope had Alyssa's name. One envelope had Sharon Hart's. Each envelope was thick with papers, photos, financial records, and construction reports Caleb had quietly collected. I had printed every document, labeled each page clearly. Everything inside was the truth Harold had been hiding behind layers of power and money. I touched the envelope with my son's name a little longer. Inside, it was everything he needed to know so he wouldn't be buried under the rubble Harold was building with his dirty hands. I wanted to tell him right away, but I knew if I gave him this envelope too early, he would think I was trying to ruin the wedding. If I gave it too late, his life could be crushed. The right timing, that was what Caleb reminded me. The right timing, that was what I repeated to myself every day. A few days later, Alyssa texted me, I hope you understand I never meant to make Nathan drift away from you. I stared at that sentence and felt my heart turn cold, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. Alyssa didn't want a war, but she wanted Nathan to belong to her family entirely, without ties, and Harold wanted that too. That was when I understood the real meaning of the fear of losing a child. It's not someone ripping your child from your arms. It's when they make your child believe another embrace is softer, safer. I folded my phone shut and breathed deeply. I couldn't blame Alyssa completely. She grew up in a world where family prestige mattered more than truth. Love was often defined by how well you obeyed. And Harold, he had taught her that. And Nathan, he loved. He was blind. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to be a good man in Alyssa's eyes. But to do that, he was unknowingly drifting further and further away from me. I reminded myself, wait, Marjorie, wait for the right moment. The night before the wedding rehearsal, I opened the safe again. I took out the 3 envelopes and checked them one last time. Photos of Harold holding the 2 children. Video of Harold transferring money into the shell company account. Fake financial reports. The list of underpaid workers markers, photos of the unfinished low-income units that were reported as completed. I organized everything neatly and put it back into the safe. I knew one day soon Harold would have to face all of this in front of his own family, and no one would be able to save him from the truth. I closed the safe, pushed it deep under the closet shelf, and covered it with a blanket. I turned off the light and walked into the living room, where the glow from the street lamp stretched my shadow across the floor. I looked at that shadow and whispered, "The wedding won't be peaceful, Harold Hart, and I'll be there. I won't let my son be buried under your fake reputation." I sat down on the chair, stretched my arms, and exhaled slowly. Outside, the night wind rustled through the old oak trees in the yard. It was a quiet evening, but inside me, a storm waited for its hour to rise. I prepared myself for everything, for the collapse, for the tears, for the anger, for the panic, for even the bitter laugh Harold wouldn't be able to force out once his mask fell. I wasn't seeking victory. I wasn't seeking revenge. I only wanted one thing: to save my son before it was too late. Nathan visited me on the afternoon before the wedding. I had just put a batch of pastries in the oven when I heard the knock. When I opened the door, the first thing I saw was my son's smile, a smile so wide it felt like it lit up the hallway. Nathan wore a white shirt, khaki pants, his hair neatly trimmed, and his eyes glowing with a pure happiness I hadn't seen in a long time. "Mom," Nathan said, opening his arms and hugging me, "tomorrow will be the best day of my life." I hugged him back, but my hands trembled. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "I'm happy for you, Nathan." But my heart felt squeezed tight because I knew what Nathan didn't. I knew the truth, the kind of truth that would break him if he learned it tonight. Nathan walked into the kitchen, sat down, and took a deep breath as if he needed courage to say something. "Mom," he said, "I want you to really be happy for me. I want tomorrow to be perfect." I opened the oven and set the tray of pastries on the counter to cool. The smell of butter and cinnamon filled the kitchen, the scent of his childhood, of Christmas mornings, of school days when I woke early to bake for him. "I always want you to be whole," I said. "But son, marriage isn't just love. It's family, and you should think carefully about the family you're walking into." I didn't say it to ruin his wedding. I said it because I was his mother. I said it because my heart hurt too much not to. Nathan leaned back in his chair, hands rubbing his temples. "Mom, you're starting again," he muttered. "Again with the Hart family." I turned around and looked right into his eyes, the eyes I once wiped tears from, the eyes I watched grow up, the eyes that lit up when he achieved his first dream. "I'm not starting anything," I said softly. "I'm worried." Nathan shook his head, giving a small, strained smile. Not the warm one he arrived with. "What is there to worry about, Mom? I love Alyssa. She loves me. Her family might be a little strict, but that doesn't matter." I asked the question I had carried in my heart for months. "Are you sure they see you as part of their family?" Nathan looked up, his expression briefly annoyed. "You're prejudiced against them." I stood still. I didn't want to argue. Not tonight. But that sentence pierced me, not because it was harsh, but because it carried the tone of Harold. And that frightened me more than any of the financial evidence Caleb had uncovered. I walked closer and placed a hand on my son's shoulder. "Nathan," I said slowly, "I'm not prejudiced. I have experience. I have eyes, and I see what you don't yet see." He looked away. When he looked back, there was a layer of defensiveness in his gaze I had never seen before. "You don't know them the way I do," he said. "I spend more time with them than you. They're not as bad as you think. You're just worrying too much." I didn't argue. I didn't say Harold was a liar. I didn't say Hart & Sons was drowning in debt. I didn't say Alyssa was being manipulated by her own father. I didn't say anything I knew, because if I did, tonight would destroy Nathan, not Harold. I simply looked at my son for a long time, so long that he lowered his head slightly, as if if he could feel the sadness in my eyes. "Mom," he whispered, I love you, but I also have to live my own life." I nodded. "And I want you to live that life in real happiness, not inside a glossy wrapper someone else created." He sighed again, a long sigh that felt like every cell in his body was being stretched thin. "Tomorrow, just come, okay?" he said. "I want you there." I placed my hand on his cheek. "No matter what happens, I'll always be there. Always." Nathan smiled, a smile that made my heart ache and warm at the same time. Then he left, saying he needed to go help Alyssa with the rehearsal. When the door closed, the house fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes your chest shake. I stood leaning against the kitchen counter, both hands over my heart, trying to breathe. Tonight, I knew I wouldn't sleep. When the streetlights flicked on, I opened the safe again. The 3 envelopes lay there, 3 truths that would change the fate of the entire Hart family. I placed them on the dining table, turned on the lamp, and began checking each envelope. In Nathan's envelope, photos of Harold holding the 2 children, bank statements showing he funded them with company money, video of him meeting the young woman in the parking lot, reports of the unfinished housing project. In Alyssa's envelope, the truth about the father she idolized, written more gently, with a note telling her she wasn't at fault, but she needed to know who she was defending. In Sharon's envelope, financial documents, proof Harold created a private fund under another woman's name, statements showing he withdrew money from their joint account. I added a few small notes to each file, short explanations, easy to understand, so no one could misinterpret anything. I made sure everything was clear, organized, and factual. By the time I finished, the clock struck 11 at night. The lamp cast a warm glow on the pages, making them look almost golden, not because of the light, but because of the weight of the truth inside them. I remembered Caleb's words. To make him expose himself, you need a big stage. And tomorrow, I would have a ballroom of 200 people. Tomorrow, Harold would think he was at the peak of his reputation. Tomorrow, the entire city would be watching the Hart family. And tomorrow, the mask he had worn for years would fall. I gathered the envelopes and placed them carefully into my purse. I touched the purse, thinking about how it now carried the fate of so many people. Nathan, Alyssa, and even Sharon. I turned off the lamp, letting the kitchen sink into the gentle darkness of the Arizona night. When I stepped into the living room, I paused at the window, looking at the sky sprinkled with tiny stars. I whispered, almost to myself, "Tomorrow, son, I'll protect you, and no one will stop me." I stood there a little longer, letting my fear and determination blend together. Tomorrow was the wedding, but for me, tomorrow would be a battle. The wedding took place under the bright, golden Arizona sun, the kind of sunlight people get used to here, but today it felt harsher than ever. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I needed time to breathe and steady myself before facing a family teetering on the edge of a cliff they didn't know they were standing on. The hotel ballroom was decorated beautifully, crisp white tablecloths, flickering candles, rows of pure white lilies lining the tables. Everything was perfect in the exact way Harold always imagined. I sat at my assigned seat at the 3rd table, not too far from the stage, but not close enough to be the center of anything. Nathan appeared soon after, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a navy tie I had given him months ago. His face glowed with excitement, though a hint of nerves lingered. When our eyes met, he smiled, that gentle, honest smile I adored. Good, I thought. My son deserves happiness, but not the kind built on lies. The ceremony passed gently, warmly, almost making me forget everything I had prepared. But that moment didn't last. After Nathan and Alyssa exchanged vows, the wedding music soared through the applause. I tried to stay calm, but my hand quietly gripped the edge of the table. Then came the toasts, the part Harold had rehearsed as if it were a performance. He stepped onto the stage amid applause, his tuxedo sharp, his smile practiced, his eyes full of arrogance. He swirled a champagne glass and looked over the ballroom with triumph. "Many of you here know," Harold began, "that the Hart family has always maintained high standards of honor and class." My heart sank. His voice dripped with poison. "And today," he continued, "I am proud that my daughter is entering a marriage we have carefully considered." I saw Nathan stiffen. Alyssa glanced at her father, confused, but Harold kept going, his tone as sharp as a blade. "To be honest," Harold said, lifting his glass and locking eyes with me as if issuing a challenge, "our family has standards, and Nathan, my new son-in-law, may not fully meet those standards yet." The ballroom fell silent. A few people gave polite, awkward laughs. My hand trembled once again. "Nathan," he said, "you're a good young man. I acknowledge that. But my daughter marrying you is a downgrade." I heard several people around me gasp sharply. Shannon, the bridesmaid, brought her hand to her mouth. Nathan looked as if someone had slapped him across the face. His expression drained, and his lips trembled. I saw his shoulders pull inward, like a child being scolded in front of a classroom. Alyssa turned toward her father, ready to protest, but Harold raised his hand as if forbidding her to say a single word. I felt the blood rush to my face, not because he insulted me, I was used to that, but because he humiliated my son on the most important day of his life. And I knew the time had come. I stood up. No one had time to react. I walked quickly toward the stage, the sound of my heels crisp against the wooden floor, each step pushing me closer to a moment I could never undo. Harold saw me and widened his eyes. "What are you doing?" I yanked the microphone from his hand as the room fell into stunned silence. A few whispers rose. Some people stood halfway from their chairs as if anticipating a scene no one dared imagine. I took a deep breath and I began. "I'm sorry for interrupting," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding like a drum. "But if Mr. Hart has spoken honestly, then I believe it's time for me to do the same." Harold moved toward me to snatch the microphone back, but the sound technician had already muted his mic. That set him off. He barked, "Turn her mic off, turn it off," but no one moved. Maybe because they didn't understand what was happening, or maybe they wanted to see. I reached down to the small handbag sitting on the floor near the stage. I opened it and pulled out the thickest envelope, still sealed with my mark. "I have something here," I said. "A wedding gift for everyone, especially for my son, my future daughter-in-law, and Mrs. Sharon Hart." That name made Sharon lift her head. Even from a distance, I saw her go pale, as though she sensed disaster approaching. I opened the envelope. Inside were the photos Caleb had taken. I held one up toward the projector. "This," I said clearly, "is Harold Hart and his second family." The room erupted with noise. I pressed the remote the technician had slipped into my hand earlier, proof they had been prepared for this moment. The giant screen behind the stage lit up. Photo 1, Harold hugging a little girl with curly hair kissing her forehead. Photo 2, him standing beside the young woman, his arm wrapped around her waist. Photo 3, the two children clutching his legs, mouths open as they called him Dad. A piercing scream broke out. It was Sharon. She collapsed onto her chair, hands trembling violently, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Alyssa burst into tears, stumbling backward as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Nathan stood frozen, his gaze torn apart between pain and disbelief. Harold lunged toward the projector, his face blazing red, shouting, "Stop! Turn it off! Are you all insane?" But the technicians, two young men who had likely endured Harold's barking during the rehearsal, didn't move. One exhaled and whispered, "Sorry, Mr. Hart. This is a valid request." Harold roared, "Valid! This is my daughter's wedding. I continued, my voice steady and strong. "And here are the withdrawal records." The receipts appeared on the screen. Detailed transfers, the shell company account, secret payments for Family M, the young woman's name. Then, the video of Harold meeting the woman in the parking lot, him bending down to lift the child, him glancing around nervously, him kissing the child's hair. The ballroom froze. No one laughed. No one breathed loudly. Everyone simply stared at Harold, at the truth, at the falling mask. Harold spiraled into panic. He rushed at me and ripped the microphone from my hand, but instead of speaking, he only opened his mouth silently. His lips trembled, his eyes bulged, his hair was disheveled, and his breathing came in ragged bursts. I could see the chaos inside him, the chaos of a man who knew he had been cornered. Harold stammered. I'm being framed. This is slander. But no one spoke in his defense. No one believed him. No one took his side. Alyssa sobbed and ran toward Nathan, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a whirlpool. Nathan, still shattered, held her out of instinct. Sharon collapsed onto the floor, her trembling hands gripping the table. A few people rushed to lift her, but her head kept shaking as if she couldn't accept the reality. The ballroom descended into chaos. Some people screamed. Some recorded on their phones. Some sprinted for the exits. Some stood frozen like stone statues. The clatter of falling glasses, scraping chairs, hurried footsteps, and sobs blended into a storm of sound, unlike anything I had heard at a celebration. But through it all, I stood still, not because I was calm, but because I had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The moment truth sliced through Harold Hart's golden mask. The moment he couldn't hide behind money, power, or his voice. The moment everyone in the ballroom saw him exactly as he was. A liar, a hypocrite, and a cruel man. And finally, the moment I could look my son in the eye and say, "Do you see now, Nathan? This is the truth I wanted you to know." Harold left the stage like a man whose world had collapsed beneath him. He stumbled between tables, stepping on tablecloths and knocking over a flower vase nearly 3 feet tall. His shouts blended with Alyssa's cries, Sharon's frantic calls, and the murmurs of stunned guests, forming a chaos beyond description. I watched Harold burst through the ballroom doors. 2 security guards tried to stop him, but he shoved them aside and disappeared. Seconds later, I heard camera shutters clicking. Reporters were already waiting in the hallway, as if Harold's downfall had been destined. I stood on the stage, holding the muted microphone. I didn't regret anything, but my heart felt heavy, like a stone sat on it. Not because of Harold, but because of Nathan. When I turned around, I saw my son standing in the middle of the ballroom like a man lost in a blizzard. His face was drained, his lips trembled, and his eyes looked as if something he believed in for months had just died. "Mom." Nathan stepped toward me, his voice trembling. "Why did you do this? Why did you ruin my life?" It felt like someone had sucked the air out of my lungs. Some words, even without malice, cut like knives. This was one of them. I didn't answer immediately. I gently touched his hand, but he pulled away, a reflex that shattered my heart. "Nathan," I whispered, "I didn't ruin your life. I saved it." "That's a lie," Nathan shouted, a cry filled more with despair than anger. "You humiliated my family. You exposed everything in front of everyone. I can't bear this." "You can't bear it because you don't know everything yet." I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope with Nathan's name. "Read it. Read all of it before you blame me." Nathan stood frozen, hesitant to take it. But Alyssa, her face soaked with tears, stepped closer and touched his arm. "Nathan, you should read it." Her voice was so shaky it was almost a whisper. I looked at her. For the first time, her eyes held no trace of the overconfidence typical of the Hart family. Only fear, loss, and realization. Nathan took the envelope with trembling hands. He opened it and pulled out the pages. I watched his eyes shift from surprise to confusion to complete collapse. Why? His voice was so faint I had to lean in to hear. Why did he use my name to withdraw the money? I swallowed the bitter knot in my throat. Harold, eager to build the image of the wonderful father, had made Nathan sign a series of symbolic forms, which Nathan believed were nothing more than routine paperwork. But in Caleb's files, those signatures had been used by Harold to legitimize several suspicious expenses. "Nathan," I said as gently as possible, "he didn't ask for your signature because he trusted you. He needed you as cover." Nathan dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. Alyssa knelt beside him. I didn't know anything. If I had known, I placed my hand on her shoulder, something I never imagined myself doing a few weeks ago. You're a victim too, Alyssa, she cried harder. Meanwhile, Sharon was carried out of the room, but she hadn't lost consciousness. Her eyes remained open, watching me through her tears. When I approached, she reached out and gripped my hand. Thank you, Sharon whispered. Thank you for saving my children and me. Her voice was barely there, but the gratitude in it was heavy. I squeezed her hand gently, saying nothing, because no words could ease what she was going through. Reporters flooded into the ballroom. Headlines flashed on guests' phone screens. Powerful businessman Harold Hart flees daughter's wedding. Leaked photos. Does Hart have a second family? Financial misconduct suspected at Hart & Sons. And I knew, in less than 24 hours, the entire city of Scottsdale would be talking about this. In less than 48 hours, all of Arizona would know. And in less than 72 hours, the Hart family would fall. Nathan stayed seated, silent like the shadow of himself. I sat beside him, not touching him, just close enough so he knew I was there. Nathan, I said, I know this is unbearable, but you must understand, I didn't do this to beat anyone. I did this so you wouldn't get pulled into Harold's crimes. He used me, Nathan said, his voice cracked. He wanted me to be his shield. I nodded. Because you're the only decent person in that family. Nathan broke down crying, the quiet, painful cry of a grown man whose heart had cracked open. I pulled my son into my arms, letting him cry the way he once did when he fell off his bike in the front yard. I have nothing left, he whispered. That's not true. I held his face in my hands. You have me, and you have the truth. Alyssa stood, wiping her tears. Her face was pale, but there was a new clarity in her eyes, the kind that only deep pain can create. Mrs. Lane, she said, I'm sorry. I thought you hated me, but now I understand you were trying to protect Nathan. I placed my hand on Alyssa's shoulder. You were never the problem. The fault lies with the man who taught you how to see the world. Alyssa lowered her head. I don't know what tomorrow will be like, but I do know this. Thank you for showing me the truth before it was too late. That night, the police went to Harold's house. They didn't arrest him, not yet, but they seized several documents. I knew because Caleb messaged me a little after 11 p.m. The evidence you provided has reached the right people. The formal investigation has begun. The next morning, the news published. Harold Hart under investigation for financial fraud, embezzlement, forged records, and misuse of social project funds. By noon, 3 investors of Hart & Sons filed lawsuits. By late afternoon, a group of workers gathered in front of the company demanding their wages. And by the morning of the 3rd day, exactly 72 hours after the ruined wedding, the Hart & Sons headquarters building was officially sealed for investigation. The Hart family, once a symbol of Scottsdale's elite, became the center of the biggest scandal of the decade. Someone called me and asked if I felt satisfied. I simply answered, no, I just feel relieved because the truth finally has its proper name. Nathan stayed at my house for 3 days straight, spending most of the time quietly lying in his room, holding on to his new reality. But each day he came out with less redness in his eyes and less trembling in his shoulders. Alyssa texted. Sharon sent her thanks. Many guests from the wedding called to apologize for laughing along with Harold, but to me, none of that mattered. The most important thing was that my son had escaped a path that would have dragged him into a bottomless pit, and I had kept my promise, a promise only a mother could fully understand. I will save you, even if I have to stand against the whole world. 3 days after the storm named Harold Hart, Nathan shut the door to the room in my house and only came out when he needed water. I didn't knock, didn't push, didn't question him. I had been a mother for more than 40 years, and I knew some pain must break on its own and mend on its own. No one else can touch it. But on the morning of the 4th day, while I was slicing apples in the kitchen, I heard hurried footsteps. I turned around and Nathan ran in and hugged me tightly, so tightly that I had to set the knife down and steady myself by holding his shoulders. "Mom," his voice cracked right into my chest. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." I felt his whole body tremble, not from cold, but because he had finally let all his defenses fall. I placed my hand on his cheek, stroking it the way I used to when he was little, then pulled him into my arms. "You don't need to apologize," I whispered. "You just need to come back to yourself." Nathan stepped back slightly and wiped his tears with his sleeve. His eyes, for the first time in days, held a bit of light again. "I got swept up in their glamour, Mom. I kept thinking that was the dream. That was the success I wanted to build." He paused for a moment, then sighed, as if he had just confessed the hardest truth. "But really, I felt like they were trying to reshape me to fit into their mold." I held his hand tightly. "You weren't wrong for loving. You were only wrong if you thought you had to lose yourself to be loved." Nathan bowed his head and slowly nodded. The next day, I received a message from Alyssa. Not long, not dramatic. "Mrs. Lane, if you don't mind, I'd like to meet you this afternoon." I agreed. We met at a small cafe on a corner of Camelback Road, where sunlight streamed through the windows, laying warm golden strips across the wooden tables. Alyssa arrived in a beige knit coat, her hair tied neatly, her face pale but without the arrogance she once carried. She sat across from me, her fingers intertwined, her gaze lowered as if she didn't yet have the courage to look at me directly. "How is your mother?" I asked. "My mom is still shocked," Alyssa answered, "but she's stronger than I thought." She said, "Maybe this is the best thing that's ever happened to me." I gave a small smile. Sharon, the woman who had always bowed under Harold's shadow, had finally stepped out of the invisible cage he built around her. Alyssa continued, "I'm sorry for ever thinking you disliked me. I didn't understand anything. I thought you just judged my family for not being good enough for Nathan." "Alyssa," I placed my hand over hers, "you were never the one I disliked. What I disliked was the lying." Alyssa nodded slightly, her eyes reddening. "I'm looking for a job now. Any job. I don't want to live off my dad's money anymore, and I know things will be hard." "Hard is the right path," I said, "but you won't walk it alone." She looked up at me, startled. "Why would you help me after everything?" I smiled, the smile of a mother who has lived long enough to understand people. "Because you were deceived too. Because you also lost something. And most importantly, because you love Nathan, not the heart Nate." Alyssa lowered her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. That evening, I told Nathan, not to pressure him into any decision with Alyssa, but so he could understand that truth always has more sides than the pain he was carrying. Nathan sat on the sofa, his fingers interlocked, thinking for a long time. "I still love Alyssa," he said slowly, "but I'm afraid going back now would throw us right back into the same cycle." I nodded. "You're right. Both of you need time. I want to start over, not as husband and wife, but as two people trying to heal." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Then you're already more mature than you were before, Nathan." The following weeks passed with a completely new rhythm, a rhythm I never thought I would experience at my age. Nathan woke up earlier, took walks around the neighborhood each morning. When he got back, he often helped me in the kitchen making coffee or preparing a simple breakfast of eggs, toast, and fruit. Alyssa moved in with her mother. They rented a small apartment just enough for 2 bedrooms, not luxurious, but peaceful and far brighter than the shadowed mansion Harold once ruled. She texted me every week, telling me about the job she found at a local clothing shop. Not fancy, but work she earned with her own hands. One afternoon, Alyssa came to my house to bring over some paperwork Nathan had left behind long ago. When I opened the door, she stood there with a soft smile, her face no longer wearing fear. "I want to help you cook dinner." She said it timidly, but with determination. "Like a family." I looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, I didn't see her as an extension of the Hart family. I saw her simply as herself. "All right," I said. "I could use an extra pair of hands." We washed vegetables, chopped onions, rinsed chicken, and talked about ordinary things women talk about while cooking. Rising grocery prices, a windy morning, stories of how Nathan was afraid of the dark when he was little. Nathan came home while we were making chicken soup. When he saw Alyssa in the kitchen, he paused. Not the kind of pause that comes from pain. The kind that comes from realizing hope might still exist. "Hey," Nathan said softly. "Hi," Alyssa replied, her hand slightly trembling but her eyes no longer avoiding his. I stood to the side, pretending to fuss with the pot, but my heart warmed. Not because they might get back together, I didn't know and didn't want to force it, but because I saw two young people learning how to rise from the wreckage. In late-night conversations, Nathan spoke more about the feeling of being manipulated. He didn't say it with self-blame. He spoke like someone looking directly at a wound so it could finally heal. "I thought I was strong," he said, "but I didn't understand that all I wanted was to feel valued, and Harold knew that. Knowing you were once weak isn't shameful," I said. "What matters is you stood up." Nathan leaned back against the sofa and closed his eyes. "Mom, without you, I think I would have lost everything." I placed my hand over his. "No, you only lost what you never truly had." One evening near the end of summer, the three of us, me, Nathan, and Alyssa, sat down to dinner together. No commitments, no promises, no pressure, just a simple meal among three people trying to heal. I looked at them and realized family isn't always made of marriage certificates or grand ceremonies. Sometimes family is simply the people who choose to sit together after the storm, even when they're still scared, still hurting, but they choose to stay. I knew the road ahead would be uneven. What happened to Harold, the court would handle. What happened to Hart and Sons, the investors would pursue. What happened to Nathan and Alyssa, time would decide. But I also knew this: justice sometimes comes at a painful cost, but it is a cost worth paying so the people you love can live truthfully. I stood up to clear the table, watching the two young people exchange small conversations, and my heart softened. I had fought. I had lost sleep. I had endured being misunderstood. But in the end, I saved my son. And I found peace again in this home. A peace not perfect, but true. A new beginning. Slow, humble, but full of hope. I always believed that time doesn't heal everything, but it reveals everything. For Harold Hart, that happened faster than anyone expected. Less than 2 months after the ruined wedding, the official trial began. The news spread across Arizona, showing Harold entering the courthouse in a wrinkled suit, his hair unkempt, his face worn as if he had aged 10 years. I didn't want to watch the whole trial. I already knew exactly what would be presented. As prosecutors listed the charges, I felt like I was hearing Caleb's notes read aloud one by one: embezzling community project funds, creating fake material records, financial fraud, falsifying data, using someone else's identity for unlawful withdrawals. Each accusation sounded like another nail in the coffin of the reputation Harold had built with a polished facade for decades. I looked around the courtroom. Many who once applauded Harold at public events now stared at the floor, unable to look up. Sharon didn't come. Alyssa didn't either. Nathan chose to stay home. Those Harold once threatened, workers, subcontractors, came in large numbers. They wanted to witness the moment the law finally called the truth by its name. Harold sat at the defendant's table, hands clenched together. It was the first time I'd seen him without his usual sense of authority. No sharpness in his eyes, no confident smile, no gold ring he loved to flaunt at gatherings. All that remained was a man being swallowed by the life he created. When the judge read the sentence, I saw Harold lean slightly forward, as if needing something to hold on to so he wouldn't collapse. Defendant Harold Hart is hereby sentenced, with total penalties and custodial time as prescribed by law. The sound of the gavel echoed like a bell closing an era built on lies. Reporters shot up from their seats. Cameras flashed nonstop. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I only felt a heavy sadness. Some people dig their own graves with greed, but the saddest part isn't watching them fall. It's seeing the innocent get pulled down with them. A few days later, the prison clerk called me. "Mrs. Lane, Mrs. Hart. Oh, I mean, Mrs. Lane, the inmate Harold Hart is requesting to meet you." I hesitated. Since the wedding, I never imagined seeing him again, but I also knew nothing truly ends until the last questions are spoken. "I'll come," I said. but I won't stay long. That afternoon, the Scottsdale wind was strong. I walked into the visitation room, surrounded by cold gray walls, the dim yellow lights making everything look tired and faded. When Harold was brought in, I went silent for a few seconds. The man in front of me was no longer the Harold Hart I once knew, the man who walked with elite confidence, wore watches worth thousands, and held his head high as if the world was beneath his feet. He wore an orange prison uniform and his hands still trembled slightly. When he saw me, Harold paused and lowered his head, something I never thought I would witness. "Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "Thank you for coming." I sat down and placed my handbag beside me. "I only have 15 minutes. Harold gave a faint, sad smile. "I won't keep you long." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that once signed countless contracts and directed hundreds of employees, now trembling, frail like those of a sick old man. "Why did you do it?" he asked. No accusation, no anger, just the confusion of someone who no longer had anything to hold on to. I looked at him and answered slowly, "I didn't destroy you, Harold. I only brought the truth to light. You destroyed yourself." Harold closed his eyes for a long moment. His shoulders shook, the first time I had ever seen him cry. Not loud, not like the outburst at the wedding, just slow tears falling, heavy like drops of late regret. "I was too arrogant," he whispered. "I thought I could control everything. I thought reputation was everything, and you lost everything to protect that," I replied softly. Harold nodded, lifting a hand to cover his face. "I lost 2 children, lost Sharon, lost Alyssa, and the second family, Hart and Sons, everything." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "But what hurts the most is that I lost myself." I said nothing. Neither of us needed to add more blame. Life had spoken on our behalf. After a long while, he looked up at me, his eyes swollen and red. "Do you hate me?" I shook my head. "I don't hate you, Harold. I'm only sad that greed turned you into someone you were never meant to become." He let out a crooked smile, then said, "If I hadn't met you that day, maybe I never would have been exposed." "I'm not the problem," I answered. "The problem is you lived too long on a lie." Harold nodded, as if he finally accepted what the rest of the world had realized long before him. When the prison officer stepped in to announce that time was up, Harold tried to speak quickly. "Mrs. Lane, if you ever see Nathan and Alyssa, tell them I'm sorry." I stood up and picked up my handbag. "I'll tell them," I said. "But whether they forgive you, that's their choice." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the ruin Harold had caused himself one more time. That was the last time in my life I ever saw him. When I stepped out of the prison building, the evening wind blew hard. The sky was strangely clear, as if the storm named Harold Hart had finally blown out of my life and out of the lives of those I loved. I stood on the steps and took a long breath, not a breath of victory, but a breath of closure. A chapter had ended. A lesson had been completed, and justice, even painful justice, had finally been carried out. I walked toward the parking lot, the late afternoon sunlight warming my shoulders like a reminder. Truth always arrives, late or painful, but it comes to free the people who need to be freed. And I knew I had done the right thing. A year after Harold was sentenced, our lives had shifted into a different rhythm, slower, steadier, and peaceful, in a way I never believed I could have again. Scottsdale was still sunny, still full of desert winds in the evenings, but inside my small family, a new season had begun. Nathan and Alyssa decided to have a new wedding, not to compensate for the collapse of the first one, but to mark a true beginning, one not built on status, money, or empty praise. They chose a small church on the outskirts of town with light brown wooden beams and stained glass windows. It was the place where, the previous fall, Alyssa had spent hours sitting in silence, searching for her peace. This wedding didn't have 200 guests, no champagne poured into imported crystal, no arrogant smile from Harold, no judgmental glances from relatives, no whispers from people who who only came to see who was richer. They invited only the people who truly mattered, those who stood by them during the hardest times, a few old friends of Nathan's, Alyssa's new co-workers, and the neighbors who supported me from the beginning. I stood inside the church, a light shawl across my shoulders, watching my son walk toward the altar. Nathan wore a simple navy suit, not expensive tailoring, but his eyes shone brighter than any gemstone. Alyssa followed behind, her white dress gentle as the breeze, her smile trembling yet innocent. No boasting, no insults, no looks of judgment, only love, pure and full. When they exchanged vows again, I felt each word sink deep into my heart. The first time, they vowed before a world built on pretenses. This time, they vowed before their true selves. I stood nearby, quietly tearing up. For the first time in more than 2 years, I felt I had truly done the right thing, right from the beginning, right in the deepest sense, right in a way that freed my heart. After the ceremony, we held a small outdoor reception behind the church. Just a few wooden tables, wild flowers in glass jars, a homemade wedding cake. Not grand, but beautiful in a way only sincerity can be. Alyssa held my hand and whispered, "Mrs. Lane, without you, I don't think I ever could have escaped that life." I gently patted the back of her hand. "No, you freed yourself. I only opened a door. You walked through it." Nathan came over and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Mom," he said, "I used to blame you, but now I'm proud to have a mother as brave as you." I laughed and tapped his arm lightly. "I'm not brave. I'm just a mother who knew her son deserved to live truthfully." Nathan pulled me into a hug, so different from the heavy hug after the storm first passed. This one was a hug of peace, of unconditional love. After the wedding, the three of us gradually settled into a new rhythm. Nathan joined a small but reputable construction company where he was valued for his real abilities. No more tense elite dinners, no more keeping up appearances to please anyone. Alyssa stayed with the job she found at the clothing store. They weren't wealthy, but she had a freedom she had never experienced before. Many evenings we ate together in my little kitchen. Alyssa shared stories about difficult customers. Nathan shared stories about funny coworkers. I listened, sometimes adding old memories, and my heart felt lighter. The things I had always wished for, honesty, peace, love without pretense, finally existed right in front of me. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, Nathan suddenly said, "Mom, I think I finally understand what you always taught me. The truth, no matter how harsh, is what frees people." I looked at my son for a long moment. "As long as you understand that, it's enough." "And I know," Nathan continued, "the real value of a person isn't something anyone can trample on unless we allow it." I held his hand. "Exactly. No one can take away your worth, not even those who once thought they had the right." Alyssa placed her hand on top of ours and smiled softly. We all learned that in the hardest way. Over the past year, I saw many people come and go from my life. Some came only to stand with me during a few stormy weeks. Some stayed and became new family. But no matter what, I realized something simple. When you live truthfully, when you refuse to bow to lies, the people who deserve you will find their way to you. I've lived most of my life already, but because of everything that happened, I feel like I just learned a new lesson, one that some people never fully understand. Peace doesn't fall from the sky. It's something you choose. You choose truth. You choose kindness. You choose to stand with what's right. And when you dare to choose, peace will come. As I share this story, I know one thing. You, the person reading or listening, have also faced unfairness at some point. Maybe not from a wealthy in-law family, but from people you loved who didn't understand your worth. If you've ever been looked down on, if you've ever been humiliated, if you've ever been pushed into the shadows because you didn't fit someone else's mold, then remember, your true worth cannot be taken. People can only make you forget it for a while. And once you reclaim it, as I reclaimed it for my son, you enter a whole new chapter of life, a chapter of peace, a chapter of truth, a chapter of your own. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Thank you for giving your time, your heart, and your understanding to this journey, the journey of a mother, a woman growing older but never giving up, And if you are still here, reading these lines, I hope you will stay with me for the next stories I share. Where are you from? Have you ever faced a moment when you had to stand up and protect your own worth? Leave a comment. I would love to hear your story. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe so I can continue sharing real-life stories. Stories of ours, of people who may no longer be young, but still have so much to say. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.